Let's start knowing how to German-occupied Europe. Hitler's racist ideology and his brutal conception of power politics caused him to pursue certain aims in those European countries conquered by the Germans in the period 1939 to 42. Hitler intended that those Western and Northern European areas in which civil administrations were installed, the Netherlands and Norway, would at some later date become part of the German Reich, or nation. Those countries left by Germany under military administration, which originally had been imposed everywhere, such as France and Serbia, would eventually be included more loosely in a German-dominated European bloc. Poland and the Soviet Union, on the other hand, were to be a colonial area for German settlement and economic exploitation. Without regard to these distinctions, the SS, the elite corps of the Nazi Party, possessed exceptional powers throughout German-dominated Europe and in the course of time came to perform more and more executive functions, even in those countries under military administration. Similarly, the powers that Hitler gave to his chief labor commissioner, Fritz Sauckel, for the compulsory enrollment of foreign workers into the German armaments industry were soon applied to the whole of German-dominated Europe and ultimately turned 7,500,000 people into forced or slave laborers. Above all, however, there was the final solution of the Jewish question, as ordered by Hitler, which meant the physical extermination of the Jewish people throughout Europe wherever German rule was in force or where German influence was decisive. The final solution, that is to say the step beyond half measures such as the concentration of Poland's Jews into overcrowded ghettos, was introduced concurrently with Germany's preparations for the military campaign against the Soviet Union, since Hitler believed that the annihilation of the Communists entailed not only the extermination of the Soviet ruling class but also what he believed to be its biological basis: the millions of Jews in Western Russia and Ukraine. Accordingly, with the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, special mobile killing squads began systematically shooting the Jewish population on conquered Soviet territory in the rear of the advancing German armies. In a few months, up to the end of 1941, they had killed about 1,400,000 people. Meanwhile, plans were made in 1941 to similarly exterminate the Jews of Central and Western Europe. At the Wannsee Conference of Nazi and SS chiefs in January 1942, it was agreed that those Jews would be deported and sent to camps in eastern Poland where they would be killed en masse or made to work as slave laborers until they perished. In the period from May 1942 to September 1944, more than 4,200,000 Jews were killed in such death camps as Auschwitz, Oswiecim, Treblinka, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Sobibor. About 5,700,000 Jews died in the course of the final solution. While Hitler destined the Jews in his empire to physical extermination, he regarded the Slavs, principally the Poles and the Russians, as subhumans, who were to be subjected to continual decimation and used as a pool of cheap labor, that is to say, reduced to slavery. Poland became the training ground for this purpose. Upon the German conquest of Poland in 1939, Hitler ordered the SS to kill a large proportion of the Polish intelligentsia. A reign of terror against the nationalistic-minded Polish ruling classes began, and by the war's end a total of 3 million Poles, in addition to 3 million Polish Jews, had been killed. Hitler further willed that the whole mass of Slavs and Balts in the occupied portions of the Soviet Union should be indiscriminately subjected to German domination, and should be economically exploited without hindrance or compassion. In the event, Ukraine was the major area subject to economic exploitation and also became the main source of slave labor. When the German armies first entered Ukraine in July 1941, many Ukrainians had welcomed the Germans as their liberators from Stalinist terror and collectivization. But this goodwill soon turned to resentment as the Germans requisitioned large quantities of grain from the farms, forcibly deported several million Ukrainians for work in Germany, and engaged in brutal reprisals against civilians for acts of resistance or sabotage. These inhumane occupation policies were practiced to a greater or lesser extent in all the countries occupied by the Germans, and the result was the beginning in 1940–41 of armed, underground resistance movements in those countries. Underground resistance was especially effective in the Soviet Union because it functioned behind fronts on which the German armies were still engaged in battle with the Red Army. The Soviet partisans, as they were called, could thus covertly receive arms, equipment, and direction from the Soviet forces at the front itself. Soviet partisans, like the members of other nations' resistance movements, harassed and disrupted German military and economic activities by blowing up ammunition dumps and communications and transport facilities, sabotaging factories, ambushing small German units, and gathering military intelligence for use by the Allied armies. By 1944, the resistance organizations in the Soviet Union, Poland, Yugoslavia, France, and Greece had grown quite large and were holding down many German divisions that were badly needed at the battlefront. In Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, the resistance came to control large tracts of land and more inaccessible areas such as forests, mountain ranges, and swamplands. Some resistance organizations, such as the partisans in Yugoslavia and the National Liberation Movement in Greece, were communist ones, while others, such as the Maquis in France and the Home Army in Poland, comprised people of many different political persuasions, though they were invariably anti-fascists. The German occupation authorities' attempts to eradicate the resistance in most cases merely fanned the flames, due to the Germans' use of indiscriminate reprisals against civilians. It is generally agreed that by 1944 the Germans had earned the overwhelming antipathy of most of the people in the occupied nations of Europe. It should be noted, however, that the German occupation was in general far harsher in Eastern Europe and the Balkans than in Western Europe. In the Soviet Union, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece, a process of resistance guerrilla warfare and Nazi reprisals began in 1941 and rose to a crescendo in 1943–44 as the fury of Nazi racism resulted in a war of annihilation upon the Slavic peoples. To decide what should be done after victory in North Africa, Roosevelt and Churchill, with their advisors, met at Casablanca in mid-January 1943. After long argument, it was eventually agreed that Sicily should be the next Axis area to be taken, in July. For the war against Japan, it was decided that 2 offensive operations should be undertaken. MacArthur should move toward the Japanese base at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, and convergent movements on Burma should be made by the British from the mainland of India and by the Americans from the sea. Politically, the Casablanca Conference owes its importance to the fact that, at its end, Roosevelt publicly announced a demand for the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Only 4 months after Casablanca it became necessary to hold another Anglo-US conference. In mid-May 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their advisors met, in Washington, D.C., for the conference codenamed Trident. There the Sicilian project was effectively confirmed, and the date May 1, 1944, was prescribed, definitively in the U.S. view, provisionally in the British, for the landing of 29 divisions in France. But the question whether the conquest of Sicily should be followed, as the British proposed, by an invasion of Italy was left unsettled. The German counteroffensive of February 1943 threw back the Soviet forces that had been advancing toward the Dnieper River on the Izium sector of the front, and by mid-March the Germans had retaken Kharkov and Belgorod and re-established a front on the Donets River. Hitler also authorized the German forces to fall back, in March, from their advanced positions facing Moscow to a straighter line in front of Smolensk and Orel. Finally, there was the existence of the large Soviet bulge, or salient, around Kursk, between Orel and Belgorod, which extended for about 150 miles from north to south and protruded 100 miles into the German lines. This salient irresistibly tempted Hitler and Zeitzler into undertaking a new and extremely ambitious offensive instead of remaining content to hold their newly shortened front. Hitler concentrated all efforts on this offensive without regard to the risk that an unsuccessful attack would leave him without reserves to maintain any subsequent defense of his long front. The Germans' increasing difficulty in building up their forces with fresh drafts of men and equipment was reflected in the increased delay that year in opening the summer offensive. 3 months' pause followed the close of the winter campaign. By contrast, the Red Army had improved much since 1942, both in quality and in quantity. The flow of new equipment had greatly increased, as had the number of new divisions, and its numerical superiority over the Germans was now about 4-1. Better still, its leadership had improved with experience. Generals and junior commanders alike had become more skilled tacticians. That could already be discerned in the summer of 1943, when the Soviets waited to let the Germans lead off and commit themselves deeply to an offensive, and so stood well poised to exploit the Germans' loss of balance in lunging. The German offensive against the Kursk salient was launched on July 5, 1943, and into it Hitler threw 20 infantry divisions and 17 armored divisions, having a total of about 3,000 tanks. But the German tank columns got entangled in the deep minefields that the Soviets had laid, forewarned by the long preparation of the offensive. The Germans advanced only 10 to 30 miles, and no large bag of Soviet prisoners was taken, since the Red Army had withdrawn their main forces from the salient before the German attack began. After a week of effort, the German armored divisions were seriously reduced by the well-prepared Soviet anti-tank defenses in the salient. On July 12, as the Germans began to pull out, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive upon the German positions in the salient and met with great success, taking Orel on August 5. By this time the Germans had lost 2,900 tanks and 70,000 men in the Battle of Kursk, which was the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets continued to advance steadily, taking Belgorod and then Kharkov. In September the Soviet advance was accelerated, and by the end of the month the Germans in Ukraine had been driven back to the Dnieper. Battle of Kursk, July 5 to August 23, 1943, unsuccessful German assault on the Soviet salient around the city of Kursk, in western Russia, during World War II. The salient was a bulge in the Soviet lines that stretched 150 miles, 240 kilometers, from north to south and protruded 100 miles, 160 kilometers, westward into the German lines. In an attempt to recover the offensive on the Eastern Front, the Germans planned a surprise attack on the salient from both north and south, hoping to surround and destroy the Soviet forces within the bulge. The German assault forces consisted of almost 50 divisions containing 900,000 troops, including 17 motorized or armored divisions having 2,700 tanks and mobile assault guns. But the Soviets had surmised the German attack beforehand and had withdrawn their main forces from the obviously threatened positions within the salient. The Germans launched their attack on July 5, but they soon encountered deep anti-tank defenses and minefields, which the Soviets had emplaced in anticipation of the attack. The Germans advanced only 10 miles, 16 kilometers, into the salient in the north and 30 miles, 48 kilometers, in the south, losing many of their tanks in the process. At the height of the battle on July 12, the Soviets began to counterattack, having built up by then a marked preponderance of both troops and tanks. Their subsequent successes encouraged them to develop a broad offensive that recovered the nearby city of Orel, now Oriol, on August 5, and that of Kharkov, now Kharkiv, Ukraine, on August 23. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, involving some 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, and 4,000 aircraft. It marked the decisive end of the German offensive capability on the Eastern Front, and cleared the way for the great Soviet offensives of 1944–45. You said? German-occupied Europe's significance. German-occupied Europe was one of the most important factors shaping World War II, affecting military strategy, economics, politics, and human history. Its significance can be understood in several key ways. 1. Military and strategic importance. Occupying Europe gave Nazi Germany strategic depth and control over major transport routes, ports, and airfields. Germany could launch attacks from multiple directions, e.g., against the USSR from Eastern Europe, or Britain from Western Europe. Occupied territories supplied soldiers, labor, and bases that prolonged the war. Example: France's occupation allowed Germany to defend the Atlantic coast, Atlantic Wall, and delay Allied invasion until 1944. 2. Economic exploitation. Occupied Europe was heavily looted for raw materials, food, fuel, and industrial output. Millions of civilians were forced into slave labor for German factories. This exploitation helped Germany continue fighting despite Allied blockades. Impact: countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands became economic extensions of the German war machine. 3. Political control and collaboration. Germany established puppet governments. Collaboration weakened national unity and created deep post-war political divisions. Occupation destroyed democratic institutions and spread totalitarian control. 4. Resistance movements. Occupation sparked powerful resistance movements across Europe. We meet again in other interesting and attractive historical stories.